I'm honored to welcome you to this very special evening on which we take the future of our planet into our own local hands. And we're very fortunate to spend this evening in the company of Costa Rican top diplomat and international expert in the field of climate change, Christiana Figueres. Also, a warm welcome to all those people who are watching us through live streaming. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome you into the Bell building, which is very colorful, as you see, but which is also one of Europe's largest passive buildings, and as such, very suitable for this occasion. Because, of course, we do want to set an example, and of course, we all came here tonight by foot or public transport, didn't we? Thank you, Mrs. Figueres. Ladies and gentlemen, under the title, the Herman van Rompuy Lectures, we like to invite people that help us to look for and to find answers and solutions that our society needs. People who look ahead and who want to share their enlightened visions with us. And tonight, as I said, we are very pleased to welcome Christiana Figueres. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to first give the floor to Tommy Hoogtanen. He's the Executive Director of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear two party leaders, Mr. Van Rompuy. On behalf of CEDER, the Study Center of CDMV, and Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, the political foundation of the EPP, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second Herman Van Rompuy lecture. As a tribute to Herman Van Rompuy, the very first president of the European Council and long-standing member of Flemish Christian Democratic Party, the CEDER had ambition to launch the series of Herman Van Rompuy lecture with Martens Center. The concept is simple. Every year we invite a very high-level speaker, a talk leader, on somebody who has high standing on European politics or is authority on the topic which is very crucial for Christian Democratic parties, on the topic which we cannot really ignore. I would especially like to thank CEDER, the institute, which is a very important part of the foundations and institutes close to Martens Center, together with more than 40 members and partners. Martens Center has activities, around 100 activities across Europe every year. Wilfried Martens himself always emphasized to us, to his staff, that for him, when he was the party leader, it was always very crucial to have the study center as really the core of the party. And I think that CEDER is continuing the excellent tradition and the work in Belgium politics, but not only in Belgium, in the European politics, contributing to the debate. And so I would like to, before we start, thank the CEDER, excellent CEDER team, especially the director, Benjamin Dalle. Thank you very much. Always when conference speakers speak, there's this temptation to label the current moment as a very unique and exceptional. But indeed, if we are looking at the times we are living and the speed or the change or in social, economic and political issues, one has to say that indeed we are living very historic times. But that speed creates a complication. It's very difficult to say what's there in the future. But what we do know about the future, that if we don't take care of the place we are living, and now we are not only speaking about Brussels or Belgium or even Europe, but our planet and environment. If we don't take care of that, we know that future will not be very pleasant for us. And that brings us to our topic, the climate change. And as already mentioned, we have an excellent speaker, very talk leader, top figure on this topic, Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I would like to welcome you. Once again, I would like to thank you all for coming. It's a full house. I would like to thank the two leaders and Mr. Van Rompuy. It's a great honor to have you here. But before more, it's my pleasure to set the floor for leader of the CDMV, Mr. Walter Peke. It's really great pleasure to have you here with us, and I wish you a very, very interesting conference. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Mr. Lieutenant. Meneer Van Rompuy, beste Herman, Mrs. Figueres, beste Rut, collega van het CDA, beste vrienden en vriendinnen, allemaal hartelijk welkom. Welkom op onze tweede Herman Van Rompuy-lezing. Een mooie samenwerking tussen onze eigen studiedienst, CEDER, en de studiedienst van de EVP, het Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. Herman Van Rompuy, zoals we allemaal weten, voormalig Europees president, heeft velen onder ons geïnspireerd en inspireert nog. Inspireerde mensen niet alleen met ideeën, maar ook met mensen te willen en te laten samenwerken, samenbrengen en van daaruit ook resultaten te boeken. Wanneer hij emeritus werd als president van de Europese Raad, 2 jaar geleden, dachten wij dat het beste geschenk in die traditie kon voortgezet worden. Namelijk mensen samenbrengen, inspireren, mobiliseren. En dus in plaats van een fles Porto, in de traditie van de oude CVP, hebben wij een Herman Van Rompuy lezing geïnstalleerd die we inderdaad dit jaar voor de tweede keer mogen doen. Vorig jaar was de Amerikaanse econoom Jeremy Rifkin te gast. Hij had het toen over economische en ecologische disrupties. De groene uitdagingen waar we het vandaag over hebben zijn zo belangrijk. Ze kunnen niet onder de mat worden geveegd. De klimaatverandering heeft zo'n grote impact dat het niet langer enkel een verhaal is van wetenschappers, maar elk van ons. Het is de uitdaging van de eeuw. Een reden te meer om er hier vanavond een punt van te maken. En ik vertelde daar straks al aan Herman en aan Mrs. Figueres dat mijn dochter gisteravond thuis kwam en ze zei: ik ben lid geworden van het parlement van de studenten in de gemeenteraad, kindergemeenteraad. En ik zeg: ah ja, wat heb je daarvoor moeten doen? Ja, zei ze: ik heb een speech moeten voorlezen. Ik zeg: wat was uw speech? En haar speech ging helemaal over het klimaat. En ze eindigde met te zeggen: ja, ik heb me kandidaat gesteld niet omdat ik de zoon ben van een burgemeester, not because I'm de dochter van een burgemeester, not because I'm the daughter of a mayor, maar omdat ik mijn vader onvoldoende kan overtuigen van het goede van de zaak, stel ik mezelf maar kandidaat. Over dat laatste gaan we nog wel eens praten, maar dat is nu niet het moment. I think today that we consider ourselves very lucky indeed, as we are in the presence of two, well, let me put it in mythical terms, Herculeans of climate change action. As President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy facilitated the agreement between the European countries on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union by 2030. This ensured a strong and credible position for the European Union during the following climate change negotiations in Paris. And tonight we welcome Mrs. Christiana Figueres, our most distinguished guest and speaker. 6 months after the failure climate change conference in Copenhagen, she was appointed Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2010. Het was tijdens deze conventie dat België het Europese voorzitterschap had en dat Joke Schouwvliegen, hier aanwezig als minister en als voorzitter van de Europese ministerraad, toen ook deze onderhandelingen meegevoerd heeft en voor Europa mee bakens heeft weten te verzetten. Joke, uw engagement daarvoor was toen belangrijk, is vandaag belangrijk en is ook morgen nog belangrijk. During the next 6 years, she dedicated herself to rebuilding the global climate change negotiations process based on fairness, transparency, and collaboration. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, her efforts led to a historical achievement, the 2015 Paris Agreement. The agreement set out a global action plan to put the world on track to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. This sounds ambitious and grand. It almost sounds as something that goes above mine and your heads. And to a certain extent it does. The Paris Agreement has been a monumental achievement, rallying the world behind a single agreement. There is nothing that can beat this in terms of achievement. You would say, true, but then you're missing out one key factor in this whole story, yourself. You are the key to making the Paris Agreement tangible. You are part of this change. Een van de grote vernieuwingen in het klimaatakkoord van Parijs was dat niet enkel naar staten werd gekeken, maar ook naar stakeholders, andere stakeholders. Daarom ben ik blij dat hier vanavond ook burgemeesters en lokale bestuurders te zien zijn. Mensen van het middenveld, de private sector. Iedereen heeft een rol hierin te spelen. Last year, the two of the most successful city initiatives of climate change, the European Covenant of Mayors and the Compacts of Mayors, joined forces and launched the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate Change and Energy. Mrs. Figueres and Vice President of this unique initiative to bring together more than 7,000 cities, representing more than 600 million people, who have agreed to take action locally to halt climate change and increase access to sustainable energy for all. Het is daar op het lokale niveau dat we grote uitdagingen vaak het eerste voelen. Denk bijvoorbeeld aan migratie. Ik geloof dan ook dat steden en gemeenten het best geplaatst zijn om concrete antwoorden te geven op deze uitdagingen. Zonnepanelen installeren op gemeentelijke daken, lokale actieplannen ontwikkelen, mensen aanzetten om ecologisch te bouwen, energiescans van gebouwen meer toegankelijk te maken, enzovoort. Op zich niet de grootste ingrepen, maar op grote schaal maken ze het verschil. Ze maken het verschil wanneer er wordt samengewerkt, ervaringen worden gedeeld en bruggen worden geslaan. Volgens sommige wetenschappers leven wij vandaag in het Anthropoceen, het tijdperk van de mensheid. De mens is de dominante factor in de toekomst van de planeet. Dat is een enorme verantwoordelijkheid. Maar in welke wereld willen wij leven? Op welke planeet willen wij leven? Hoe gaan we daarvoor zorgen? En wat kan ieder van ons daarvoor doen? I believe that the UN Sustainable Development Goals can provide an answer. They are mirrors for the world we want to live in, a world we cannot also create. We can also create. The implementation of the Paris Agreement is a crucial part in achieving this more sustainable world. It's a responsibility of governments, the private sector, the civil society, and everyone us presenting here today to enact and implement climate-related policies. In de toekomst zullen initiatieven tegen klimaatverandering steeds verrassender en ook inspirerender worden. Het viel me bijvoorbeeld op hoe de Belgische bisschoppen onlangs vroegen aan de kerken en aan de banken waar ze meewerkten om hun investeringen te verschuiven van fossiele brandstoffen naar duurzame energie. Een gevolg van de encycliek Laudatio Si, waarbij de kerkliefdadigheidsinstellingen, NGO's en de private sector zich samen inzetten om de duurzame ontwikkelingsdoelstellingen van de Verenigde Naties te halen. If we look across our borders at Germany, we see how important part of the engine that drives the spectacular transform from nuclear energy to green energy are more than 800 energy cooperatives of local communities, municipalities and cities. In cooperation with the private sector, They are sustaining the energy transition from the bottom up. What also caught my eye is the importance of the Paris Agreement attaches to the role of women. Climate change urges us to invest in the science of nature, in knowing how vulnerable ecosystems are, and which geographical locations will be struck hardest. But climate change is also about people, and knowing how we will be most affected is crucial in making headway. We weten dat de gevolgen van klimaatverandering niet genderneutraal zijn. Vrouwen zullen er meer door getroffen worden. Klimaatbeleid moet hiermee rekening houden. De rol van vrouwen in het beleid tot op het hoogste niveau is dan ook essentieel. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a challenge that calls upon all of us to be involved and at the same time involve each other. Climate change is first and foremost a story about the future, about our children, about our grandchildren. Even more, it entails an urgent call for the next generation. If ever, now is certainly the time to live up to this urgent call, now that it is still within our power to change the destructive course of climate change. Ik heb 3 kinderen en ik zou willen dat zij en hun kinderen na hun kunnen leven in een wereld waar ze alles kunnen bereiken. Maar ook een plaats waarin het goed is om te leven. De klimaatuitdagingen laten zich vertalen in 2 prioriteiten. De verantwoordelijkheid dragen voor de wereld die we zelf gecreëerd hebben. En de verantwoordelijkheid voor de levenskwaliteit van de generatie die na ons komt. Rentmeesterschap. The Paris Agreement puts a cap on the amounts of carbon and other greenhouse gases we can emit. The math is very simple. The more we waste and the more we emit, the less margin next generations will have, diminishing their prospects for a decent quality of life. Our responsibility, therefore, stretches far beyond our own lives. More than ever, we are the stewards of the future of humanity. So far, we have heard alarming calls about the environment. Even more alarming is how some refuse to acknowledge the reality of it all. But let's face it, by now we know climate change is real. It's happening as we speak. We have the numbers, the statistics, the data. The science is settled. The public mindset about climate change is also set in the right direction. An increasing number of European citizens now see climate change as a very serious problem and believe that fighting climate change and using energy more efficiently will bring economic benefits. What we need to do is both very simple and very complex. We need to make it work. Local leaders like you here tonight, because we can only push back climate change. That's the only pushback that we will afford. Climate change by starting from the bottom up with grassroots initiatives and local level. But also thanks to the global leaders like Christiana Figueres, I sincerely believe we have serious shots at a more sustainable world. A distinguished Costa Rican diplomat, Mrs. Figueres, held high-level positions in the government of Costa Rica. She founded the non-profit Center for Sustainable Development in the Americas during her time in the United States, and she was a member of the Costa Rican climate change negotiation team for 15 years. No wonder she received the Hero for the Planet Award from National Geographic magazine. As Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, she knew how to turn defeatism into optimism. She showed the path forwards where countries went astray. And when many regarded climate change as an insurmountable challenge, she made them see the opportunities. This is why we invited you tonight, to listen to your inspiring story and learning from her and learning from you how we can be a part of this change that you initiated. I'm very honored to give you the floor, Mrs. Christiana Figueres.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Mr. and Mrs. von Rompuy, thank you very much for being here in person, and party leaders, thank you very much for being so generous that you've invited the daughter of the leader of the Social Democratic Party in Costa Rica to be with you here today. It is quite wonderful when you can shake hands across the aisle. As we know, it takes collaboration to move forward. Ladies and gentlemen, so we have heard a lot about climate change. We've read a lot about climate change. I wanted to take a little bit of a different tack with you today, tonight in this, because if I understand correctly, it is your inspiration, Mr. Van Rompuy, that this lecture series should be dedicated to thoughts about how to address global issues from a positive point of view. And so that is the inspiration that I would like to follow tonight. And I would like to suggest that, to begin with, that all of us are incredibly privileged to be alive right now. To be alive right now and to witness the most amazing and far-reaching transformation that humanity has ever set for itself. Because we are right in the middle of an energy transformation, which admittedly is not 100% of the answer to climate change, but it's a big part, 70% of the answer to climate change. And this is an energy transformation that, for the first time in human history, is a transformation that is being incurred upon in an intentional manner, because the last one that we had, which was the Industrial Revolution, actually came about because of the discovery of fossil fuels and the development of the technologies to use those fossil fuels. So from the market and from technology. This transformation that we are pursuing now actually stems from policy and is science-based, a very different starting point to an energy transformation. The other point I would like to make is that this energy transformation is not just about changing our sources of energy. That would be complicated as it is, going from fossil fuels to renewables. Actually, that would be too simple. Because what this energy transformation means for the world, it means actually a multidimensional impact, and one that is actually mutually reinforcing toward the betterment of humanity. So let me unpack that a little bit for you. We all know that moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we all understand the environmental impacts of that. Certainly from a health perspective, though, that move is very clear. Whether it is from human health, because the burning of fossil fuels has affected and continues to affect, by last count, 6.5 million people sick or dead because of fossil fuel burning around the world. So whether it is from our personal health or our planetary health, which is no longer the local pollutants but the global pollutants, it's very clear that moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy is definitely better for our health. But I'm not going to go into those aspects because those are well known by you. Tonight, I wanted to invite you into a thought journey, and into a thought journey of all of the other dimensions that come with this move from fossil fuels as the basis of our economy to renewable energy as the basis of our future economy. I would like to suggest that there are at least 3 different dimensions that we're dealing with: the social, the economic, and the political. So to the social first. Consider, if you will, the disruptive nature of renewable energy. The disruptive nature because renewables, certainly solar and wind, but the others as well, are actually fundamentally different in their characteristic than fossil fuels. And they are forcing a complete transformation of the energy structure And if you don't believe it, take a look at what is happening to the German utilities that are having to turn themselves around because of the introduction of renewables in Germany. But we will be seeing an energy structure that is much more nimble, that is much more flexible, and that is actually much more responsive to demand and supply. It is also disruptive because of the cost. Just 2 days ago, we had another record broken on the cost of renewables. The cost of solar has been coming down 90% over the past 10 years, but we just broke the record again 2 days ago in Mexico, where we're now generating solar for 1.77 cents the kilowatt hour, compared to where we were just a few years ago, 10 or 12 or 13 cents. So quite an amazing revolution, I would say, an exponential drop in cost and an exponential increase in penetration of renewables that is being completely disruptive to the energy system, and is, from a social understanding and from a social science perspective, is moving us from the space of scarcity into the space of abundance, and from the confined and finite sense of energy confined to certain geographies and finite because fossil fuels are finite, moving us to the social dimension of ubiquitous energy as a completely different concept that we have never had in our history, ubiquitous and unlimited energy, having a slow but sure social impact on the construct that our society is built on. The second part that is affecting our social dimension, and one that is particularly important to me, is that renewable energy is deepening our access to energy. So we still have 1.3 billion people around the world in the year 2017 that do not have access to electricity. Frankly, that should be unacceptable. 1.3 billion people around the world that do not have access to electricity, which means without that, it's impossible to come out of poverty, and it is impossible to improve their health and their living standards. And with renewable energy, because of the decentralized nature of our renewable energy, we can now provide basic electricity to 1.3 billion people around the world, exemplified by Prime Minister Modi's very fantastic announcement just a few months ago that he plans to electrify every single Indian home that doesn't have electricity, of course, with renewable energy. So a very different construct for the basis of society, because we now can actually individuate energy generation and take it to the individual, to every individual home, to every individual person, as frankly as a right that every human being has. So a huge revolution undergoing there in the social construct of our society. On the economic side, renewable energy is doing to the energy sector what Kodak refused to believe that the digital cameras and the digital technology would do. So imagine, if you will, that Kodak as a company was founded in the year 1888. And because they were in that time in which progress was linear and not exponential, which we have now, it took them 90 years to build the company up to 17,000 employees, that was their max, and to command the market of photographic paper. 85% was commanded by Kodak. It took them 90 years to get to the top of the market. Then what happened? Then in 1975, the first digital camera came on the market, and 10 years later, Kodak was gone as a company. Talk about devaluing the incumbent. Devaluation of the incumbent. Digital photography completely devaluated the technology that Kodak represented, and Kodak could have been part of the revolution, but they refused to believe in the devaluation and in the disruption that the new technology was going to bring. So now fast forward that today, we're in the Kodak moment of coal. The Kodak moment of coal. We are now witnessing the demise of coal. We thank coal. I thank coal. The industry, the technology, the resource, I thank them for everything that they did in the last century, because much of the economic development that we all enjoy, certainly on this continent, if not in others, is actually due to coal and the other fossil fuels. However, just like any person who has reached the maturity of their age, we thank them, we honor them, and we retire them. And it is time to retire coal. And coal is actually being retired. And the last news that we're seeing is actually pretty impressive. So 48% globally, 48% of all permits that were already moving into the construction of coal mines and coal plants have been canceled, and 62% of all of the coal plants that were in early stages of constructing have actually been stopped. China and India being the first two countries and the most aggressively canceling and freezing their coal capacity, leading to what many analysts believe is a peaking of coal in China, certainly, and perhaps a few years later, a peaking of coal in India. So a very important time in the history of mankind, because the next generation will not even know what coal was. They will go to the museum to find out what coal was, and you know what coal has done for civilization. So a very powerful devaluing of the incumbent technology, and I would actually dare to say starting with coal because it's the most carbon intensive, but not stopping there. Really stay tuned to see what is going to happen with the other incumbents, with oil certainly, with the electrification of vehicles, and then with natural gas. The second very important impact that renewables are having from an economic point of view is the dematerialization of energy. What do I mean by that? I mean the same thing that smartphones did for cameras. Does anybody remember what a camera was? Well, we have one here, but there are few. There are a few of these around, and you will remember, if you're in my generation, and the newer generations won't already, because they have been dematerialized, but we used to have a camera. We used to have a video recorder that was separate from the camera. We then, if we were very, very advanced, we actually had a GPS system that was a thing that was a GPS. We had calculators. Who remembers what a calculator is? We had all of these things that have now been dematerialized. They have actually disappeared because your smartphone is smarter than all of those things put together and multiplied times 100. So that dematerialization that we've seen, and by the way, you have noticed, I'm sure, that the smartphone is dematerializing the music industry and now the banking industry. When was the last time that you actually wrote a paper check, or that you in fact went to the bank? Most of the banks are closing their offices because everybody is doing things electronically. So that dematerialization that has occurred is also occurring in the energy space, right in front of our eyes, and we haven't noticed it. Because think about it. We used to, because I'm already in the future, we used to dig up coal. It was this black, disgusting thing that we used to dig up and wash and then transport across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles to be burned to pollute both the cities and the global atmosphere. And the same thing for oil and gas. Less pollution, but basically the same. Well, with renewable energies, we have dematerialized energy. Have you ever tried to put your hands around a ray of sun? It doesn't have a substance, does it? Have you ever tried to put your hands around a gust of wind? It doesn't have a substance. We have dematerialized energy, and we will continue to dematerialize. cutting, of course, huge costs in extraction, in production, in transportation of all of the former raw materials that we used to use for energy generation. So a huge impact on the economic structure of energy in our society through the dematerialization of energy. And then, of course, we have the very happy coincidence that all of this happens at the same time in which we are witnessing the explosion of digitalization. And so the combination of renewable energy coming on the market the way it is and digitalization means that we're actually going to be able to reach economic efficiencies on energy like nothing we have ever seen before. We will not have latent energy that is there, that is latent, that is not being used. We will have the perfect, eventually, I mean the future, you understand, eventually with digitalization and artificial intelligence, we will have immediate supply and demand of energy, and we will be able to be so efficient about energy that some analysts have actually already said that we will be seeing population growth unless we figure out what to do about that, but we will be seeing 2 billion people come to this planet, brothers and sisters who will join us here, but that will not necessarily mean that we will have to increase our energy. Heretofore, we always thought that GDP was right there in sync with GHG, GDP and greenhouse gases, i.e. fossil fuels. For 150 years, they have gone together. We know that that is going to decouple, and that's very basic. What we didn't know is that it is also possible to decouple population growth and economic growth, particularly in developing countries who need still to continue their economic growth, decouple that from energy production. A complete revolution in terms of the meaning and the presence of energy in our society. And then the political implications. Well, the political implications are fascinating. Have you ever considered that renewable energy actually democratizes energy? Because we are able, because renewable energies are so much smaller and individuated and decentralized, we can democratize completely both the generation of energy. I'm sure you've seen the photographs of an African hut with a woman installing a solar panel on her hut. So we can do that. And there are millions of African huts that now have solar panels and will continue. We can completely democratize the generation, and we can democratize the benefit of use. That is a political revolution that is going to be fundamental to raising extreme poverty levels into graduating them into middle classes and affording those people a dignified and a beneficial life. And the last piece that corresponds to the political dimension is the effect of renewables on geopolitics. Because renewables, I would suggest to you, actually disentangle geopolitics. Now, if you're in my generation, you would have grown up with learning that geopolitics was completely enmeshed with fossil fuel location. Think of the countries that have fossil fuels and that export fossil fuels. And geopolitics was completely enmeshed with the transport of fossil fuels. Think of the many wars that have either been fought or averted to protect the transport routes of fossil fuels across this world. Well, that entanglement of energy, power, electricity with geopolitics is about to disappear, because now we're moving into a world in which every country can use its own germane, national, within their boundary energy sources. They will use the energy sources that are their own, that are under their control, and they will not have to import or to protect geopolitically their relationship with fossil fuel exporting countries, and certainly not have to protect the transportation routes of those fossil fuels. So a very, very different geopolitical situation into the future that I would say equalizes in a fundamental manner, equalizes the relationship between countries, and in fact, inside of countries because of the democratization process, because geopolitics is both international as well as internal to countries, and that will also, the democratization process of renewable energy will actually allow for a very different relationship of towns, villages, communities with their national government. So a revolution underway that has certainly environmental aspects, but you know those, but also social, economic, and political. And of course, we will see all of this. I'm painting a thought journey for you here. I'm drawing an arc. We're not there yet with all of this, but we're certainly on our way. And we will see it materialize as soon as we can get the proper alignment that we're moving toward, a proper alignment of policy, technology, and capital in order to expand the dissemination of renewable energies across the world. So you see that this new source of energy is actually not just a source of energy, it is an integrated, holistic approach to a new basis of society, a new basis for us to relate to each other, and I would call it actually a solution prism. And the reason why I call it a solution prism is because in the face of complexity in which we are right now, in the face of complexity, we need to understand that the solutions that we put forward can no longer be solutions that are siloed. Over here, we're going to solve environment. Over here, we're going to solve social injustice. Over here, we're going to solve the political relationship among countries. That silo thinking no longer has a place in the 21st century. We have to now move, as we have here, with this solution prism that is multifaceted, that has tentacles, if you will, into all of the different dimensions of the social construct, and that is not just multidimensional, but actually mutually reinforcing. That is the way that we will be able to tackle the complexity of issues, certainly of climate change, but many others to come. Whether it is water, whether it is migration. You understand that in the 21st century, we are no longer into discrete issues, but rather facing global issues that need this multidimensional and mutually reinforcing approach, a solution prism. So because of the challenge posed by climate change, humanity really has already embarked on the construction of a solution prism. I would argue that this experiment that we're all having is the first time that we're looking with that amount of complexity and multidimensionality at an issue that is in front of us, and that addressing climate change is perhaps going to the gym for global issues. So we're strengthening our muscle on how do we approach global issues and how do we ensure that there is a multidimensional and interlinked solution space being created. And I would pose that by doing that, certainly with renewables and answering the challenge of climate change, we are actually creating a planet that is more environmentally and economically stable, that is more socially just, as I have argued, and more politically peaceful. I would also, however, warn that many of the lessons learned from this experiment may be applicable to other issues, but some may not. So the space for creativity and ingenuity is always there, and I invite everyone to move into that space. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we heard a very inspiring and positive story tonight with a very positive conclusion also. Fighting against the climate change is very good for us. It's like going to the gym. And also very positive, as Wouter Beke pointed out, we can do something about it, about this climate change. We, as in you and I, we are the key. We're all part of this change. So let's talk a bit more about our local footprint and how it can be felt on a global scale. And may I also invite Peter van Kemzeke to the table. Peter is a diplomat. How are you?
Very good, very good.
Welcome, Peter.
We're good friends.
Yes.
Peter is a diplomat, ladies and gentlemen, who fell in love with the European Union. He worked at the cabinet of President Herman van Rompuy. He's now working at the European Commission. Peter, in what areas are your
Energy and climate.
Energy and climate,
That's my
that's
field.
Is there anything else to work in?
No.
Not tonight.
Not tonight.
Not tonight, no. And you're also active in local politics. So you take this saying, think global, act local, quite literally, do you?
I think so. I try to, yes, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start from that one. Think global, act locally. Does that apply to the climate as well, Mrs. Figueres? Do cities matter in fighting the climate change? Does the local level matter at all?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the fact is, so I've attempted today to give you a very global view, deliberately to raise our gaze toward the future that we're constructing. But there's no doubt that climate change needs to be approached at all levels. So, you know, starting from individual family, starting from an individual, going to the families, going to villages, to communities, to cities, to provinces, states, regions, and countries. And the best results, of course, are in those countries in which there is a perfect alignment of policy, technology, and capital investment across all of those levels. Now, it is present in some countries. There is one country in which that's not currently present. But in most countries, you do see that alignment.
No silos there, as you pointed out, no silos.
Yeah, I mean, the silos is different because I was speaking about sectoral silos, right? I mean, here I'm talking about not a horizontal approach, but rather a vertical approach of alignment of policy that is best done when it's fully aligned.
Mm-hmm. Peter,
It's actually a very interesting question because you started by saying that I'm a diplomat. When I joined the diplomatic corps, I could never, some years ago already, I could never have thought that I would sit here talking about cities. Yet now a lot of diplomats, you're dealing with countries, you're dealing with the international system and so on. In the European Union, you're dealing with member states. But it's impossible to discuss climate issues and global issues without making a link with the local level, with the cities. And it's a bit of a complex story, I think, because on the one hand, it's clear that cities are part of the problem. If you look at Europe, 70% of the Europeans live in cities. Cities are responsible for 80% of the energy consumption, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, so they are part of the problem. But at the same time, we also see that they are increasingly so part of the solution. 80%, again in Europe, of our GDP is produced in cities. Most of public expenditures and almost half, a bit more than half, of public investments are done by cities. So if the cities, if the mayors manage to invest in the right infrastructure, not in the infrastructure of the second industrial revolution, but of the third industrial revolution, if they manage to work with their local companies in the direction that you just set out, then I think you can have that modernization of the economy. So it has to go through cities. That's why one of my favorite quotes is one of Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, who said, well, when you look at the 19th century, it's the age of the empires. The 20th century of the nation states. 21st century, it's actually the age of the cities. Mm-hmm. Also because they are more ambitious than member states. We have to be honest on that. If you look at, I think there are a lot of local representatives here or mayors. I think everybody knows the Covenant of Mayors, the EU Covenant of Mayors. If you're not part of the Covenant of Mayors, shame on you, I would say.
But stand up and leave.
Sign up immediately. Sign up immediately. Because it's a wonderful instrument, and I think in Belgium almost 300 cities communities are actually part of the Covenant of Mayors. Well, if you look at those commitments, we end up with a reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions with 27% by 2020. The goal, the target, is 20%. So they are overachieving. Cities are more ambitious than member states.
Mm-hmm. You know, what Piers just said is absolutely true, and it is even more critical in developing countries. Because in the EU, or in fact even in the OECD, the infrastructure that exists is infrastructure that is already there, that has a huge legacy impact, and that if you want to bring it up to speed, you need to invest in the renovation of that infrastructure, but which is pretty expensive. But the situation in developing countries is exactly the opposite. 60% of the infrastructure that we're going to need for urban spaces on this planet, 60% has not been built yet. And all of that 60% is in developing countries. So you can imagine that if we proceed over the next 10 to 20 years, imitating the construction of last century, we're going to lock ourselves into infrastructure, and that is built environment, roads, you know, all this infrastructure that goes with cities that are more designed toward roads and cars and bridges than they are toward people. And we'll lock ourselves into emissions that will take us way beyond the 2 degrees. So it is absolutely critical that cities in particular, where all of this infrastructure is going to be built, understand that they are facing a huge new opportunity to build cities that are human-centered, and that are organic cities, and that are energy efficient and water efficient and food efficient. So it's a very, very different and yet complementary. What is the same between OECD and developing countries is that cities and mayors, as who is it? Mike Bloomberg always says the problem with mayors is that everybody knows where we live and they come and knock on the door. And that's absolutely true. You don't knock on the door of the president of the republic, right, or the prime minister. You knock on the door of the mayor. But that's good, because there is huge expectation now from citizens for mayors to do the right thing.
Okay, so
Many
we
of
agree
them
on
are
this
here.
one. Cities do matter.
I think we agree on a lot of things. But
Yeah, if you were trying to get us to disagree, it's going to be difficult.
Well, let me try. How can we convince mayors then that they should engage? Because let's face it, investing in the climate is quite expensive sometimes. You don't always see a direct outcome. You probably won't win the elections on this topic. So why would mayors want to fight climate change? Please do give them a reason, Mrs. Figueres.
Well, first of all, it's not expensive, right? It's a question of how do you attach a value to this? Copenhagen comes to mind. So in Copenhagen, and we were just talking about recycling, but Copenhagen has such a fantastic waste management system that Copenhagen, as a city, only sends 5% of its waste to a landfill. That means they're actually extracting from the rest of the 95%, they're actually extracting a value. And they are minimizing their waste management costs because they are being able to separate what still has a value and what no longer has a value. So it's not, and energy efficiency is also the very obvious example where any investment in energy efficiency over the long run, yes, of course, you have to make the upfront investment, but over the long run, it absolutely makes sense because it brings down your running costs. And the same thing goes for renewable energies, right? Renewable energies may have an upfront cost, everyone does, but guess what? The marginal cost of fuel of renewable energy is 0. Has anyone ever received a bill from the sun? No. Has anyone ever received a bill from the wind? No, right? And in front of that, you know, contrasting to that, you have fuel prices, whether it be oil or, you know, gas or whatever, that go up and down, completely unpredictable, and you never know, as a city, how to actually manage those costs.
Do you have some other benefits up your sleeve?
I think the first one isn't important. There is clearly an economic benefit and there is a business case. And if you look at our cities, and I stick to Europe, for example, our cities are really becoming living labs, living laboratories, where new technologies are tested on the spot, on the ground, where new business models are tested and so on. Think about China and India, where they're building literally hundreds of smart cities. Wouldn't it be great that our technology is used, that our companies are used, because we have actually the experience on the ground? So economically, very important, I think. Secondly, a mayor definitely has a responsibility to protect. It's a concept from a completely different sphere, international politics again. But they do have the responsibility to protect their cities, their infrastructure, but also their people, I think. And I think, Christiana, what you said in the beginning, the reference to the health issues, I think it's something we sometimes should communicate a bit more often. I remember the meeting with Mike Bloomberg in Bonn, where he said maybe we're focusing a bit too much on climate change, and we should also talk about the impact on human health. It is an important issue. If you look at the figures of the World Health Organization, they predict that between 2030 and 2050, you will have 250,000 additional deaths because of heat stress, on top of the 400,000 deaths that we already have in Europe because of air pollution. This is a big argument, I think, and it's a responsibility, again, of mayors to protect their citizens. And a third reason maybe I want to mention, it's an argument that always the young people remind me. I just came from a mini climate summit here.
You were a young person.
That's what I thought till I was discussing with the millennials over there.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
It's all relative. But they say it's always interesting that when you talk about climate change, you talk about the economic benefits, about the business models and so on. But there is a moral reason as well. And I'm always a bit embarrassed that it's young people who have to remind me that there are also moral reasons for it. It's basically we only have one planet. There's no planet B. We have to make it great again, as Macron would say. So make our planet great again. But it's a moral obligation, because you make the link with the next generation. What we are doing now is basically to make the planet livable for future generations.
Yeah.
It's also an argument, I think, apart from the economic and business models.
Well, I don't know whether there are any mayors in the building that need any more convincing. Anyway, let's give them some best practices. That always works. Do you have some other examples, Mrs. Figueres, of local policies that do work?
Well, many. Actually, the whole range of transportation policies comes to mind, whether it is the metro being built in Quito, Ecuador right now, that is actually going to cut down commutes by 50%. And cut down, of course, pollution, or whether it is the bus rapid transit systems that are being built in so many different cities, whether it is the bike sharing programs, which are really taking off, in particular if they have intermodality and they can take you from one place to the other. The fact is that, just on transportation, we do know that there is one scenario in which cities are getting more congested, more polluted, and more, frankly, unlivable. That is one scenario. And if we continue down that route, it's going to be very, very difficult for families to live in cities in a healthy way and in a productive way. And we have another scenario in which you actually do bring in the new technologies, be they metro, BRT, bicycles, electric vehicles, driverless vehicles, and you completely change the transport in cities and make cities agreeable again. You clean the air, you have less pollution, and you make it so much more productive, because you do lose actually a huge amount of potential GDP and economic growth just because you're sitting in a traffic jam, in addition to your bad mood. It's a bad mood personally, and it puts the economy in a bad mood. So
as well.
Yeah, exactly. So just on transportation, and there are so many different options that are there, and the best is, of course, when they're all interlaced.
Mm-hmm. Peter, you're also active in local politics. How do you take action?
My city is not a smart city. No, not yet. But I think what Christiana just said, cross silos, that's extremely important. I mean, it doesn't make sense, I think, to really focus on mobility policy, energy policy, construction sector, and so on, completely separated. All the best practices that come to my mind, in one way or another, find interactions, synergies between different areas. The mayor of Vancouver, he's one of the members of the board of the Global Covenant of Mayors. He said that when you renovate a building, when you make it more energy efficient, or when you build a zero emission building, you also have to make sure that there is a charging point in the building. So basically,
for electric vehicles.
For electric vehicles, indeed, for electric vehicles. So
not
basically,
for your phone. Oh, for your phone also, but
also for the phone, but that's a bit smaller. Yeah,
it's a bit smaller.
For electric vehicles. So basically, what you do is you give an incentive to electric mobility, while at the same time renovating your buildings and making them more energy efficient. This is something that we also proposed from the European Commission. We said for every 10th parking space in a big building, there should be a charging station, because it makes sense, I think. Member states don't like it that much, but I think it makes really sense to do it. Another good example is, for example, when you find a synergy between the digital, you mentioned a lot of the importance of the digital, and mobility. Or street lighting. Street lighting is a very good example. Paris has around 200,000 street lights. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not useful. So basically, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, she asked a small startup, Numa, to work together, to sit around a table with a French telecom operator. He said, like, try to get the data, work with those data, and try to map where the people are at which moment of the night. And based on that, you can reduce the intensity of the street lighting. Thousands of euros of cost saving, and you save greenhouse gas emissions. That's another good example. And then I think, because we're talking about the local situation here, a very best practice in the energy field is try to get your energy sources as closely as possible to where you have to consume them. Budapest, fantastic example, fantastic city. I think the people who have been to Budapest have certainly been to the thermal baths. The Széchenyi baths, for example, they use the heat of those baths to basically heat the zoo next door. If you go to Stockholm, the central station in Stockholm, people are running for their train. They produce body heat. They capture the body heat and use it to warm the office buildings next door. If you have schools, for example, in schools, indeed, we were together in Stockholm, and that's where the example got from. When you go to schools, for example, more and more schools, they are using special material so that when the children are playing, they're playing soccer and so on, they actually generate electricity. You can't go more local than that. These, I think, are the best practices.
Okay, so let me rephrase my former question. You don't live in a smart city, or your city is not a smart city yet, you told me, because of course you would like to do something about that. How would you take action?
I think first of all, what is very important is indeed go to local sources of energy production. You have, I mean, if you live in a city that used to be an industrial city, where we have plants, they also have the excess heat, for example, that you can use. I think one of the main deliverables we have now, untapped deliverables, is in our social housing sector. Energy efficiency for social housing. That would be a main priority, I think, in my city, but in a lot of cities, there are a lot of social housing companies. If they would join forces, because one of the difficulties right now is to get access to funding. That's one of the main difficulties. I think all the mayors say this is very difficult to get access to, for example, European funding, EIB funding, and so on. Why? Because the projects are too small. You don't have sufficient scale. So bring the social housing companies together, bring the cities together so that you have really projects of scale. I believe very much in renewables, but at least as much in energy efficiency. The cheapest energy, the cleanest energy is the energy that you don't use, that you don't consume.
A very good example of that, actually, of social housing is in Mexico City. They have a very rapidly growing social housing construction program where these houses are energy efficient, water efficient, and produce much of their own food, and are located very close to public transportation. And the way that they're selling those homes is that they have privileged loans for those homes, because usually when you buy a home, the value of the loan that you take on is based on the value of the structure, but you never take into account the operating costs of that house. Well, if you take into account the operating costs of that house, you realize that these efficient homes actually cost much less to run. They're going to save on energy, they're going to save on water, they're going to save on food, they're going to save on transportation. So if you put those savings if you internalize that saving into the value of the home, then these people can actually get much better conditions for their loan, and hence they have a financial incentive to buy that kind of home, because you have actually given a value to all of the savings of operating the home for 20 years. And that, that very often in energy efficiency, that's the problem, that you don't take advantage of the savings that come later. You don't upfront them into the infrastructure that is being built.
Mm-hmm. So very good, creative ideas. Do you think that mayors have enough tools and instruments to tackle this climate change, Mrs. Figueres?
Well, I mean, it's sort of a strange question, honestly, because everybody always wants more tools and everybody also needs more tools. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we say, right, we have enough. The fact is that all of this is a learning process. We've never had to face the challenge of climate change, so it's all a learning process. But I do think that there are many city networks, the Global Covenant, C40, ICLE, many city networks that actually are focused exactly on that, on being exchange platforms for cities to learn from each other what went well. Sometimes the best learning is what didn't go well. What can we learn from? What should we avoid? And there are many city networks that are really very focused on that in terms of, and they divide it up sectorally in terms of waste management, energy, public lighting, heating and cooling. There are many different best practices that are being developed by some cities and then shared with others. So there are, there's never enough tools, but there are enough tools out there, certainly, to engage and start with, yes.
Yeah. Peter, as a diplomat who fell in love with the European Union, what can Europe do for the mayors?
Oh, quite a lot, I think. And I think, to be honest, we are doing quite a lot already, but we can also definitely do more. I think first of all, it's a matter of legislation. So the power of the European Union is legislation. And there, if I'm honest, our legislation, European legislation that was adopted in the past, was not always really fit for the local level. And this is changing rapidly. The more contacts we have with mayors, the more we see that sometimes we have to also take into account the local needs. I'll give you a very concrete example of that. A mayor who wants to renovate in buildings, energy efficiency of buildings again, very often his policies are in contradiction with the Eurostat rules. It means, simply said, that whatever you invest in the renovation or the money you spend to renovate your building is considered debt. Stability and Growth Pact and so on. So really this blocks, to some extent, initiative in renovating buildings. So we listened very carefully, and it was mainly because of Marianne Thijssen, who is in charge of the Eurostat rules, that last September, we changed it. We changed the Eurostat rules so that it's now much easier for mayors, basically, to start investing in that area. So it's a matter of legislation, I think, under certain conditions. Secondly, definitely access to finance. Access to finance is key. Next week, the Vice President, for who I work, will actually present a new platform, an investment platform, making it easier for cities also to have access to European funding. Two things are very important in that. Cross-silo projects. As we mentioned, this comes back over and over again. But also we want to really stimulate cities to work together. The best example in Europe, one of the best examples in Europe, is Rotterdam, The Hague, and 21 municipalities who sat together and they decided to form one entity to have joint public procurement. It's much cheaper to buy 10 electric buses than 100 or 200 electric buses, but also to develop their own projects together. The same thing is more or less happening in Limburg, where 44 mayors are joining forces. The next step, I would say to those mayors, use the new instrument that will be available as of next week to get funding for that. But aggregation of projects, it's a very important thing. And maybe the third thing we can do is exchange best practices. The city networks have a role to play. But you know, there are so many, when you say, do the mayors have tools? I think there are so many possibilities, be it public procurement, the setting of targets, for example. It's very important that the city sets clear targets. This is what I want to achieve. Not in some random manner, but rather detailed. I mean, you have to be able to measure the progress, to monitor the progress. I think it was the mayor of Vancouver again who said, some is not a number and soon is not a time. You cannot say, I will reduce some greenhouse gas emissions and I will do it soon. An investor will not buy that story. So you need to set targets, you have to measure it, and there the European Union can also help. And then I think the main, and it comes back to what you just said, you have to involve the people. Yeah. It will never work, those policies will never work without the people. And sometimes you have that feeling of NIMBY, not in my background, in my backyard. We have to change NIMBY to PIMBY. Please, in my backyard, do it with us. I think through energy cooperatives you can do that. I was recently in Breda, where we have a very nice project. It's called Zonneweide. And I have to translate it a bit in this I can only explain in Dutch, because it's weide met lange ei. So us, it's us. Okay. It's not with ei, with korte ei, maar met lange ei. So it's basically het wij-gevoel. We do it together. These are our windmills. These are our solar panels. They belong to our city. Yeah. We create our own energy. And if you manage to mobilize the people, I think this is a prerequisite. Otherwise, it will not work.
So I don't know whether we had a hashtag already tonight, but if you want to tweet about this evening, I suggest that the hashtag should be PIMBY. Please, nice. In my backyard.
You can also be more creative. Eh? You can, I think as a mayor, you can start gaming. Gaming works very well. I just, with the young people, it's all about gaming. I learned a lot. But as a mayor, for example, you can basically, you have several districts in your city. Why don't you organize a competition between the several districts? Who is the most energy efficient? And you measure it, and then you have a competition. These are things that work, I think.
One more question for you, Mrs. Figueres. The international negotiations on how to implement the Paris Agreement will continue in 2018. How important will be the role of cities in those talks?
It's absolutely critical because the fact is that national governments, they have to be very conservative and they will continue to be very conservative. And because of the geopolitics that we're dealing with now, they will be very reticent about increasing their ambition, as we call it, about deepening their emission reduction targets, which they must do by March of 2020. So it is very critical, and that's where Peter and I work together to bolster their confidence through the very concrete, on-the-ground policies and measures that are being implemented by cities, by states, by provinces, by regions, and by corporations, all of whom actually can deliver the emission reductions for profit, and therefore give national governments the confidence that they need to increase their ambition by 2020. They will not be able to do that in the absence of proof and evidence that this is actually possible and that people, planet, and profit can actually be put together. And that is what all of these measures are. It is the coming together of benefit for the people, benefit for your profit, bottom line, and benefit for the planet. And those three things can come together. We used to think that they competed, but they don't. But we need concrete proof of that. We can't just read it in a book, in the literature, right? We need concrete proof, and we need measurability. So it's going to be very important for all of these efforts, whether it's city, state, province, region, corporations. It's going to be very important to be able to measure that. And be able to give numerical, quantifiable input into national countries so that you provide a basis for their confidence and they can give a stronger political signal. Because the fact is that a lot of what is being done now is because of the strength of the political signal of the Paris Agreement. But that was only the first part. every 5 years, national governments have to increase and deepen that political signal.
Okay. Christiana Figueres, Peter van Kemzeke, I thank you very much for your enlightening ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, Mrs. Figueres will be very happy to answer them.
And
Please.
Peter, too.
Well, I stay.
Yes.
Okay, I stay. That's
Stay,
fine.
Peter.
She-
Please do formulate them in English if possible, and
sorry
be
about that.
brief and to the point. I saw one hand there. Yes.
My name is Professor Van de Voorde. I'm here as a director of the Max Planck Institute. Last week, we had a meeting in Rome on the topic of the 9 billion people who will be there in 2050, and how can we give them the energy available. So the point was how to transfer the energy of today and what was planned today, mainly the nuclear and the fuels, etc., how can we transfer them into the renewables? And to have a long story short, one of the fundamental elements by the world academies worldwide was we don't have the science and technology available in order to get renewable energies in the near future. And if you look a little bit about the efforts given presently, you don't have to talk about Flemish or Belgian or the Netherlands where it is catastrophic. But if you look for Europe and you take the European program, and I was also director in research in the European Union for many years. And if you look a little bit about the present European program, the Horizon program, and if you look about the topics about the energy, and particularly looking to the climate from a climate change point, is very poor. And I'm also in the 2020-2027, the very new European programs are coming along, and that topic has not great attention. But if you look a little bit about what is happening in various countries, then I would say there is one country where the research and technology is more advanced, and regrettably, that is the United States. If I see what we are doing at the MIT and at the Caltech, the wonderful schools in the United States, there we are quite well advanced. So my pledoi, I have 2 points, and the first point is, it is wise and needed that one looks to everything what has been said today. But one of the fundamentals is we need science and technology. If you look about a number of, if you take now the batteries and so on, at a certain moment, we cannot go further what already had been said by Peter van Kemzeke, that one of the important elements is the efficiency. If you make a transfer from the sun to a technology on 10% or 20%, that is ridiculous. You should have 80, 90%, and that technology is not available. And the second point, which is critical, that is, you need for that technology the rare earth metals. And the rare earth metals, we don't have anything in Europe available. They are only stationed in Russia. They are stationed in India and in China, and a little bit in the United States. And the rest of the world don't have it. So the rare earth metals, which we will need for the transfer, are not available. And what is happening then in the world today in order to achieve what one is talking? 70 new nuclear reactors are in the process to be built, mainly in India, also in Russia, but also in the United Kingdom.
Okay, so
Finland cannot be forgotten either. So I would like to say the second point, or the fundamental is science and technology is the fundamental area, and all countries should put much more money into science and technology in order to achieve that goal. Thank you.
Mrs. Figueres, would you like to respond to this?
I would love to respond to that because I certainly agree that we need more investment in science and technology. I'm not sure that I would agree with you that the United States has the leadership in that exclusively. I think there is, if you have a Western view, that may be true, but you have quite a bit of technology being developed in the East as well. In China. And, you know, we can only hope that over the next 3 years, that investment in science and technology in the United States will continue. We don't know if that is so, but certainly it would be a good thing for that. So yes, definitely science and technology. I think actually it's a little bit unfair to judge technologies that are still nascent. Certainly storage is very, very nascent. And so I think it's a little bit unfair to judge technologies that are still in their birthing years with other technologies that have been around for quite a while. I fundamentally agree with you that we need more science and technology and that policy should be science-based.
Okay, now, however interesting your remarks are, I'm going to have to ask you to keep it brief so as to give everyone an opportunity, or more people an opportunity, to ask a question. Do I have another question? I see one hand in the middle. Can we get the microphone over there?
Thank you. You talked about renewable energy replacing both coal and gas and oil, but I was wondering, what do you see is the position of nuclear energy in this whole story?
So first of all, let's differentiate one thing, and that is that the replacement of coal is not you take one out and you put one in, because they have very different characteristics, and so you do need, for a full replacement, you'd certainly need renewables that have backup firming capacity. And the big question then is who's going to firm it up? And ultimately, we should get to the point where we would have storage capacity, or storage technology that would be able to back up so that you have 100% clean energy. We're not there yet. And so we will very likely see a period of time that will be, I don't know how many decades, in which probably natural gas will be used to firm up renewable energy for electricity purposes. Very different is actually to replace oil, because oil is typically not used for electricity. Typically, oil is used for other industrial purposes, such as transportation. And so there, the replacement, which is a little bit of a stretch word, the replacement is that renewables are actually entering into the electric grids, and it is the electricity that is actually replacing oil in light transports, independently of what the source of electricity is. So there you actually have a race against time, if you will, where electric grids and renewable energy generators are racing to clean up the grid as much as possible and as quickly as possible, versus the race to electrify vehicles. So it's not, you know, a sort of take out, delete, and it's not a delete and replace or search and replace method at all. With respect to nuclear, I've always thought that nuclear is a very, very important national decision, that no one can define or decide for any country whether they can and should use nuclear. And I would say there are two things that every country should seriously consider. One is safety, and the other is comparative cost. By the time you go to fourth generation nuclear, you really have increased the cost. Now, if you're a country that can really afford that, to go to fourth generation nuclear, which is very safe but is much more costly, then that's a national decision. And it has, of course, a completely different effect on the grid than renewable energies. But fundamentally, summa summarum, there is no one single source of energy that is the magic bullet. Actually, every country has to look for a balanced portfolio of energy sources that are going to be unique to that country and that are going to speak to the current and future needs of that country.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Please pop up your hand if you have a question. Over there? Oh, yeah. I can't see you with the lights. Sorry.
Hello. Hope you can hear me. Mrs. Figueres, congratulations for your energy tonight and in your whole battle. I was wondering, do you sometimes get frustrated when politicians really don't seem to live up to their promises? Like, for example, in this country? What do you actually say to them?
I thought you were talking about another country. You know, yes, of course I get frustrated. Of course I get frustrated because I live with an alarm clock inside of me, and I certainly recommend that all of you swallow the alarm clock, because we are really running completely out of time. So yes, I do get frustrated. And at the same time, I never look at those political positions or the lack of those policies as a permanent reality. I always look at it as a transient reality. And I focus, if you will, you know, when you're in front of the ocean and you see that the waves come in and out, right? You have a low tide and you have a high tide. And these political waves are low and high tides. The important thing is, what is the undercurrent? What is the big picture trend that we're seeing? And how quickly are we changing that trend? Because the fact is, most countries are living in democratic systems, not all of them, but most countries are, and you will inevitably always see changes in policy, always. So what you really have to look for is beyond those changes in policies toward the underlying transformation that is occurring and measure that against the urgency of the transformation.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, over there.
Yes, hello. Good evening. There was an interesting comment made earlier to say that we need to make the right decision now, because if we, for example, regarding spatial planning and different things, we make a decision now, we're going to be locked in for 40, 50 years. Just a small observation, the European Union is still funding highway projects in cities in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment that basically going to make their suburbs car-focused for the next 40, 50 years. For example, a city like Bratislava in Slovakia, 650,000 people, doesn't have a subway. They're currently building a second ring road funded by EU RDF funds. I think there's a big... Those sort of decisions haven't really entered the sort of real-life politics yet, I think. Just maybe a comment and a question at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Peter maybe has
Yes.
some... Go ahead.
Well, there were two comments basically on the European Union. Maybe I combine them. I think the first comment made on the importance of science and technology, I totally agree. We have Horizon 2020, 8 billion euros. It's a lot of money. But the problem has been that our efforts have always been a bit too fragmented. So that's why this year we said, let's focus on some very key technologies on which we can make progress. Renewables is one of them. Batteries is another one. Because it's not normal that batteries that we use here, or the battery cells that we use here, are made in China, for example. We should be proud Europeans. We have the money. We should invest in those technologies. On funding, I think there the focus is shifting. If you look at the list of projects of common interest, for example, because these are the big infrastructure projects to which you refer. It's true that there is a big legacy, usually to some extent also determined by member states who say, my preference is still this or this or this. What you see in the last three PCI lists, projects of common interest, we see a gradual shift, moving away from everything related to fossil fuels, clearly going in the direction of smartening the grid, because that's another one. I mean, I said that I'm a strong believer in renewables. It also comes back to your point. If you look at a study that was released only today by the European Climate Foundation and yesterday by the International Energy Agency, it's clear that time is in favor of renewables. The cost is going down dramatically. And I think you also made this point. Renewables, together with demand response flexibility. It doesn't sound very sexy, we have to find another name with it, but basically it's making consumers more active, making sure that they can consume the energy when it's cheapest and so on, and this will lead to more energy efficiency. If you look at renewables together with smartening the grids and so on, this kind of projects, this is where the funding is going. More and more, I would even say so. So it's true that, and I'm the first one to admit that we still have projects that could be better. But if you take a look at the recent decisions being taken, it's very much part of the Energy Union project. And I will never forget the first line, the first objective of the Energy Union strategy that was adopted in 2015. We have to move away from an economy driven by fossil fuels towards a new sustainable economic model. And the funding will inevitably follow those political priorities.
I think it's important to understand that this is a process, right?
Yeah,
it's not, the economy doesn't turn on a dime. Yeah. It's a process, and that's what I mean by identifying the trend. So while you have some cities that are still stuck in transportation models of last century, at the same time, you have other cities and, in fact, other countries that have understood where we're going. And you have countries like the UK, Scotland, because it took a different target, the UK, Scotland, France, Norway, certainly, that have taken actually quite ambitious transformation targets with respect to their electrification of their vehicles, but also a much longer list of cities that have actually decided that they are going to move and they're going to ban diesel vehicles because of health reasons, or ban vehicles altogether in the center of those cities. So not everyone will change at the same time. If you understand how change occurs in a society, you will think of it as a bell curve, if you will. So you will always have 15% more or less of early adopters that move very quickly because they can see where things are going. And I would say, you know, from a big systemic point of view, those were the ones that helped us in terms of cities, corporations. Those were the ones that helped us to get to the Paris Agreement and are moving very quickly. Then you have about 60% more or less, or 60 or 70% of bulk in the middle, the big hump of the curve, that are the second wave of change agents that will follow the leaders, but clearly come as a second wave. And then you'll always have 10 or 15% of laggards that are going to have to be pulled out of their reticence, but you don't worry about them in the beginning. You work with the leaders that are in the front part of the curve, and you move the change into the bulk of that curve to then have a critical mass that moves forward. You will never have 100% of any city, government, guys, the national government, corporate, nothing. Nobody will ever be at 100% dedicated to and devoted to change. That is just not human nature. So you work with the leaders, the early adopters, and you move it into the critical mass.
Okay, I think we have time for some more questions. If you have some inspiration left. Over here. Are there any questions? Over there. Okay. Do we have a microphone?
Hello. Hi, my name is Zanna.
Okay, where are you?
Yes,
okay,
I'm here.
Okay, over there.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much, both to Ms. Peter and Mrs. Figueres. I'm a very big fan of both of your work. I was actually also at COP, so I have seen you speak actually quite a few times in the last few weeks. First of all, I wanted to make a small suggestion coming back to the remarks you made on tools for cities to tackle climate change. Cities like Roeselare and cities like Hasselt have joined Climate Alliance in the last few years, and that is exactly the sort of organization and network that cities can join to benefit from sharing experiences and basically looking at best practices. So that's just a small suggestion from my side. But my question relates to the role cities can play in closing the gap between what countries have laid on the table in light of the Paris Agreement and what we actually need to do to achieve the 2-degree and actually the 1.5-degree objective. And recently there was a study by the Royal Belgian Meteorological Institute saying that temperatures will rise in cities like Brussels and like Antwerp by 2 to 5 to actually 3 to 5 degrees. And this is, science. This is really science. Now, and then I also have a question for Mr. Van Kenseke. You referred to the fact that cities have, their combined efforts have resulted in a 27% reduction or will result in such reduction by 2020. I was wondering if this means that either they have really done their homework or that their homework was basically just too simple. And by that, my question is, do you believe that the EU should really ratchet up its targets vis-a-vis the Paris Agreement obligations, and this especially in light of the Talanoa dialogue and the ambition mechanism that's inclined in the Paris Agreement, which we absolutely need to bring us to a 2-degree world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. First, Mrs. Figueres.
Yes, there's no doubt. I mean, we've always known that there's a heat effect in urban areas for very obvious reasons of the concentration of population, the transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So the conclusion to that is cities have even more of a reason to contribute to addressing climate change because they are disproportionately affected with respect to heat versus rural areas. So that is absolutely true. In addition to what Peter has already said, that they do concentrate, and by just a few decades from now, we will have at least 75% of population and of GDP or of GHG of emissions coming from cities. So just the stacking of the incentives and the motivations for cities to actually do something about climate change is huge.
Okay.
I'm also very happy that you mentioned the city of Roeselare for a simple reason. We've been talking about big cities, Paris, London, and so on. But I think it's equally important to underline that every single city, a city of 30,000 people, 15,000 people, and so on, can actually do quite a lot, because we're all part of this global covenant of mayors, 7,500 cities. Even the smallest cities can contribute. And if you look at, the example of Roeselare, one of the Flemish cities, it's really impressive what they are doing, because in Europe we have an urban partnership for the energy transition where cities work together, and Roeselare is playing in the league of London and Warsaw. So I think, I don't know if the mayor is here, but it shows that you can also show leadership if you come from a relatively small city. It's true that when we look at the 2020 targets, there is still some low-hanging fruit. I think for the 2030 targets, it will become much more difficult. The low-hanging fruit is gone. We have to be more disruptive. We will not get there with a measure here and a measure there. We really have to, we really need structural changes. On the EU targets, I think it was I remember very well, it was the final European Council under the leadership of President Van Rompuy, where we basically fixed the European targets for 2030. Minus 40% greenhouse gas emissions, at least 27% renewables, and at least 27% energy efficiency. At that moment, I think, unanimity, it was not easy to get to those figures amongst the 28 member states. When we were looking, that was October 2014. So this is only 3 years ago. In the meantime, we are beefing up our target for energy efficiency. So we're now working with a target of 30%. It's only in 3 years' time. And what is happening with renewables, in the light of the new reports that we get, we also see that the assumptions that we made in the European Commission only 2-3 years ago on, for example, the cost of renewables were simply wrong. Our estimates were 2 or 3 times higher than what is happening now. So what we are doing is reassessing the real cost of renewables, reassessing our targets. And it's now in the hands of the European Parliament and the Council. But I think if we make the modeling now, you see that whether you go to 30% renewables, maybe a bit more, or 27% renewables, it is cost effective. So just to show how fast things go. On the other hand, I also have to say, and the minister is here, it's it's not that easy. When you give a target to a certain member states, now you have to do this, you have to achieve this in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for 2020 or 2030. It requires really a lot of effort. We shouldn't underestimate it. I will never forget the negotiations that we had, whether it should be 40% or minus 35%. And all the member states came to see us. Basically, they said, let's be ambitious. Right? We want to go for 40% or even more. And then, of course, we did the calculation, the effort sharing. This means for this member state, this effort. For that member state, that effort. And then they said, yeah, but in our case, we are a unique situation. It's not possible to do it. And if you would add up the real commitments, you ended up with not even 35%. So what is the advantage of the European position is that, and we are unique in that, we have certain targets, but we've also translated them in binding legislation. It's sometimes forgotten. You have a lot of parties to the Paris Agreement who say this is our intended goal, this is what we will achieve, this is our national contribution, and so on. In the case of the European Union, it's enshrined in legislation. It shows that our commitment is serious, and this is an important point, I think. Of course, at a certain moment, we will have the facilitative dialogue, 2018, and in light of also a new study of the IPCC, we have to see whether our contribution will be sufficient. But I think this is also global stock taking, and in light of that, the European Union will also have to look at these targets, I think.
Okay, thank you. One last question. We have time for one last question. Yes, gentleman in the middle.
I'd like to know your opinion about carbon dioxide capturing. And with carbon dioxide capturing, I mean capturing carbon dioxide that's being produced either in the production or energy of energy, or sucking it out of the atmosphere as is currently being done in Iceland. Do you consider that as a futile exercise or as a nascent industry?
So my view on carbon capture is that the natural system of the planet has a huge carbon capturing potential that we haven't used and exploited to its full potential. So first, let us restore lands and let us capture as much carbon as we can and put it back in the soil, because what we have to remember is that carbon is not the enemy. It's the location of the carbon that's the problem. Carbon in the soil is good. Carbon in the atmosphere is not good. So let's put it back where it belongs. Let's put it back into the soil and keep it underground. It's like real estate, location, 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 right? Okay. Now, to your other question, which was not answered by that. Industrial carbon capture is, I would say, yes, a nascent industry that honestly, I think 3 or 4 years ago, many of us had a very, very high hope for that. And that is another technology that has not received as much research and development investment, because that is a technology that could be a very important part of a broad portfolio of solutions, but that is not safe enough yet, except in Iceland, because of very, very different geological formations that are unique to Iceland and not to other countries. And it is certainly not at market, at a reasonable cost yet. I mean, my last count, CCS or CCUS was actually possible at a cost of more than $100 a ton of carbon. Well, we're far away from that. So we need to bring the cost down. We need to make it safer. And if we can bring the cost down and if we can make it safer, then yes, it's a part of an interesting portfolio. But we're not there yet.
Okay. I thank you very much.
Can I finish with this story?
Yes, you can.
I wanted to finish with a story because you talked about little towns. And I'm assuming that there are mayors here of little towns. So I come not only from a very, very small country that only has 5 million people, but within that little country, I come from a little town that is 15 square kilometers, that's it. And there are 30,000 of us in this little town. Now, what is fascinating about that little town is that I recently went to a mayor meeting, and my jaw dropped because I saw Ana Hidalgo from Paris sitting right next to the mayor of my wincy little town, having a conversation about who had actually implemented policies that were more far-reaching. And, at the end of the conversation, Ana Hidalgo had to say, you know what? I tip my hat to you. You've done a better job than I. That is really fascinating, right? Because it is also about volume and scale, but it's not only about volume and scale.
Size does not matter always.
Size contributes, but little countries, little people, and little towns can also contribute very importantly.
You certainly can. I thank you very much. This is Christiana Figueres. Revive our planet. We owe it to our children. We all are the change. That's a haiku. I didn't write it. Tonight's insights and ideas briefly summarized in 3 lines in a haiku. Poetry can do that. Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to give the final word to the man who lent his name to these inspiring evenings, who can write haikus far better than I can. Please lend him your ears. Ladies and gentlemen, Herman van Rompuy.
Dear Christiana Figueres, meneer de voorzitter, mevrouw de voorzitter, mevrouw de minister, burgemeesters, lokale mandatarissen, dames en heren, mag ik zelf zeggen, goede vrienden. Ik wou eerst in het Nederlands de organisatoren bedanken voor dit initiatief. Dit is de tweede keer dat dat gedaan wordt. En als ik hier kijk naar wat er hier voor mij staat, dan heb ik echt de indruk dat ik belangrijk ben. Het feit dat men een lezing noemt naar uw naam is altijd een heel grote bekroning. Dat wil ook zeggen dat je uw loopbaan achter u hebt. Want anders doet men dat niet. Maar ik ben zeer erkentelijk dat men dat telkens organiseert. Ik ben zeer erkentelijk voor al diegenen die komen. Want het is de tweede keer dat we het doen. En de tweede keer dat we op eigenlijk een voor dat soort van toch meer intellectuele activiteit zo'n massale belangstelling hebben. Dus mijn grote dank gaat daarnaar. I'm very happy that Christiana Figueres accepted to deliver this keynote address because it's about the future. Not only of a country, not only of a continent, but of the human species. Dedication to such a cause makes a life meaningful. History will show how important the work of Christiana Figueres was. We are aware of it already now. Will we survive? Yes, we can. The problem is not awareness, but acting according to our convictions and intentions. We can see the good and do the opposite. St. Paul already knew it 2,000 years ago. Seeing the good, but doing the opposite. I'm deliberately not referring to those who ignore scientific facts and are denying the man-made character of climate change. For some, it has to do with intellectual arguments, how bizarre it seems. Mostly economic interests are behind those so-called intellectual insights. And sometimes for climate skeptics, it is political opportunism, the lack of political courage to take unpopular measures. And sometimes ideology prevents people acknowledging the sad reality of our planet. A combination of all these reasons brought the United States to pull back from the Paris agreements, or try to pull back. The United States is now the only country in the world doing so. Even if the president is not fully representative of his country. How unbelievable it is. It's a shocking fact. On a moment that our future is at stake, we are faced with very short-term aimed populism on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a paradox. But Trump is not the only one to blame. That would be too easy. Implementation of the Paris Agreement is a responsibility for all nations. And the current hesitations have to be overcome. Keeping our word, acting according to previous decisions, is key for our credibility. And credibility is key for the belief in our democratic institutions. This is also valid for the European Union.
as Peter recalled it, my last European Council of October 2014 was dedicated to our climate targets for 2030, putting minus 40% forward as our key figure for greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990. In the meantime, our GDP has grown with 50%, and greenhouse gas emissions will be on a declining path of minus 40% if we can get that goal. By the way, we will respect our 2020 goals. Often it's said that politicians are not keeping their word. We are respecting our goals. We managed to have an agreement with 28 on this goal for the 13 upcoming years, even accompanied with many detailed measures on the way to go. I confess that not all problems were solved in October 2014, but we kept, for instance, also Poland on board. We spoke with one voice in Paris. I have the famous saying of Henry Kissinger, Europe, whom have I to call? By the way, if you have to call the United States, do you have to call the President, his Chief of Staff, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense? America, who to call? We spoke with one voice in Paris. We have to work hard to keep it so. In the post-Paris 2015 era, and after a withdrawal of the United States, the global climate issue needs the European Union even more. The European Union and China are now the biggest global actors to implement what was historically agreed, even if the European Union is no longer one of the biggest polluters. Belgium, too, shouldn't be lagging. If the world can agree, we too have to agree between our three regions and within each of our regions. Dear friends, multilateralism in general is not doing so well last years. The UN Security Council is almost powerless in areas of war, such as in Ukraine or in Syria. The World Trade Organization failed in reaching a multilateral trade deal. However, the world is performing better on climate change and on key millennium goals related, inter alia, to extreme poverty. In a world of growing nationalism on every continent, and especially among all non-EU global actors, multilateralism is more important than ever. Globalization is present in every dimension of politics. Globalization needs a corresponding governance. The global markets need a countervailing power in order to bring them to the common good. We created in our societies the socially corrected market economy after the war. But the national or the regional level cannot be a countervailing power anymore. We need more Europe and we need more global governance. This global governance will not be a single body, such as the G20 of the UN Security Council, in each domain, such as climate change or others. We have to look for appropriate, workable decision-making institutions. We have to be pragmatic whilst we are dreaming. In Europe, we are very pragmatic. We have for our decisions a mix of what we call the community method, where the European Commission is playing a key role, and the intergovernmental method with a central role for the member states, trying to find a balance between the European and the national interests. And sometimes the member states take decisions unanimously, sometimes with a qualified majority. There will be no world government, but many world governance bodies. A step-by-step approach, but always keeping the right direction and not going backwards. Yes, I believe that mankind can make progress, even irreversible progress. The European Union as a peace project is a striking example. Brexit will not undo that process. Christiana Figueres is also at the forefront of the battle for having modern cities as a vice chair of the Global Conference of Mayors for Climate and Energy. The world will become not so much a village, but a city. The challenge is to make our cities places for, by, and of the people. Technology, digital technology, can help us to create more mobility, less pollution, more space, more security, more energy saving. Technology is a tool, not a name in itself. Never forget it. It has to be at the service of human beings. In cities, you can breed liberty and creativity, but also poverty and criminality. London is a pro-European cosmopolitan city, but other cities in Europe are nests of nationalism and of folding back on itself. In Western Europe, in Brussels, as well as in Flemish cities, a lot of work has to be done to fight for integration of all citizens and against unemployment for mostly young people with a migrant background. Brussels and Antwerp have similar problems if you look at the figures. The future lies in the cities, rightly or wrongly. It's also a challenge for our democracies. How to avoid anonymous democracies with citizens only formally involved at the occasion of elections. Cities need decentralization in the field of democracy and centralization in the management of large-scale problems. How to avoid the democratic gap at one level and the leadership gap at another level. As always, you need two blades for a scissor. Making our cities more humane is making our world more humane. Making our citizens more harmonious with less ghettos, with a broader social and cultural mix, with less living apart together. The reflection on the future of cities comes in Belgium and in Flanders at the right time, 1 year before our local elections. Dear friends, smart cities are not enough. We need prosperous, secure, and fair cities and countries. And these three components are also crucial for a project of relaunch of the European Union. The three objectives, prosperity, security, and fairness, are at the service of a new balance that needs to be found in our Western societies. The balance between open democracies, open societies, open economies at the one hand, and on the other hand, a better protection of people against threatening trends or perceived threatening trends. Unemployment, unsecure jobs, massive illegal migration, climate change, all kinds of dumping, social dumping, commercial dumping, tax dumping, inequalities, terrorism, corruption. We need openness and we need protection. If we fail to protect people better, we will end up with protectionism and nationalism. As simple as that. But coming back to climate change, the long term is the red thread in a series of short-term projects and ideas. The future begins now. Implementation of plans has to start now for the sake of credibility. Words and deeds have to conquer, as simple as that. Our societies are looking for orientation, for a sense of direction. Where are we heading to? And the current political volatility shows disarray and even despair. We must turn fear into hope. But hope is also a verb. Civil society is often full of creativity and hope. We aren't in Europe the continent of the sunset. But empathetic leadership is also needed. It's the opposite of populism. They tell the populist, they tell the people that they are right and that all the rest is wrong. That there is one enemy, one truth, one solution, and that all the rest are liars. And we, from our side, have to say and to prove that the populists are wrong. That's the battle for the hearts and the minds in the years to come. The battle for our civilization. The battle for Europe. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasant duty of inviting you to the reception. Stay safe, keep the planet safe, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. Een heel goede avond.